The airport was alive with the usual commotion, the bustling footsteps of travelers, the rhythmic beeping of announcements, and the occasional burst of laughter from excited vacationers. At Gate 12, however, the atmosphere was tense. A middle-aged woman with blonde hair, dressed in an elegant beige suit and pearls, stood near the boarding line, her face contorted in frustration. Across from her, a tall black man in his mid-30s sat in silence. He was dressed simply, a navy hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. His posture was calm, almost too composed for the sharp, accusatory words she hurled at him. "I don't know why people like you think you can just loiter around in places like this," the woman said loudly, her voice cutting through the air. Heads turned, some curious, others clearly uncomfortable. The man lifted his gaze slowly. His expression remained neutral, though his dark eyes carried a depth that made a few onlookers glance away in discomfort. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "You heard me," she snapped, her hand clutching her expensive handbag tighter. "People like you always hanging around where you don't belong. This is a private flight gate. Go back to the regular terminal." The man's calm demeanor didn't waver. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely curious. "And what makes you think I don't belong here?" Her scoff echoed through the terminal. "Oh, don't play coy. It's obvious. You're probably trying to sneak into first class or something. Security should have taken care of you already." Passengers nearby exchanged awkward glances, some clearly embarrassed by her outburst. A young couple whispered to each other, debating whether to intervene. The man simply leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Well," he said quietly, "it's interesting you say that." Before he could continue, an airport staff member approached, their face a mixture of unease and professionalism. "Ma'am," the employee said politely, "is everything all right here?" "This man," the woman began, pointing an accusatory finger, "is harassing me. He's loitering here and he clearly doesn't belong. Do your job and remove him." The staff member blinked, looking between the woman and the man. Their gaze lingered on the man for a moment longer, as if recognizing him before they said calmly, "Ma'am, I assure you everything is in order. He has every right to be here." The woman's face turned red with indignation. "Unbelievable. I'm filing a complaint. This airport is going downhill fast." The man, still seated, gave the staff member a small nod of gratitude. Then, without looking at the woman, he added, "Patience is a virtue, ma'am." She rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath as she stormed off to the corner of the gate, where she continued to glare at him from a distance. The announcement system crackled to life. A crisp, professional voice echoed through the terminal. "Attention passengers. This is the final boarding call for Flight 157 to Miami. Please proceed to Gate 12 for immediate boarding. Thank you." The blonde woman, still fuming, adjusted her pearl necklace and strode confidently toward the boarding line. Her impatience was evident as she tapped her foot, glaring at the gate agents. About time, she muttered loudly enough for those around her to hear. Meanwhile, the man she had berated remained seated, casually scrolling on his phone. Several passengers passed him on their way to the line, some offering small, apologetic smiles, while others avoided eye contact entirely. As the line moved forward, the woman noticed the man hadn't joined the queue. A smug smirk crept onto her face. "Figures," she whispered to herself. "Probably doesn't even have a ticket." The staff at the gate scanned boarding passes with practiced efficiency, smiling politely at each passenger. When it was finally her turn, she handed over her ticket with a flourish, her chin held high. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," the gate agent said with a smile, returning her ticket. She gave a curt nod and strutted down the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the floor. Once aboard, she quickly settled into her seat in first class, fluffing the complimentary pillow and sighing loudly as if the entire ordeal had been exhausting. Back in the terminal, the man finally stood. He stretched lazily, adjusted his hoodie, and made his way to the gate. The whispers began again as a few passengers recognized him from earlier. "Is he really getting on this flight?" a teenager murmured to her mother. The gate agent's demeanor shifted instantly upon seeing him. Their smile widened, and they stood a little straighter. "Good evening, sir," they greeted warmly. "Your aircraft is ready. Shall I escort you to the tarmac?" "Thanks," he replied with an easy smile. "That won't be necessary. I know the way." The gate agent stepped aside, motioning for him to proceed. As he walked toward a private exit leading to the tarmac, a couple standing nearby exchanged confused glances. "Wait, he's not boarding the same plane as us?" the woman whispered to her partner. "No, he replied, watching the man disappear through the door. That's the private jet access. The realization hit like a thunderclap for those paying attention. Murmurs spread quickly, and a few passengers peeked through the terminal windows, watching as a sleek black and silver jet awaited its owner on the tarmac. On board Flight 157, the woman leaned back in her seat, her expression smug. She sipped her champagne, thinking her flight was finally free of distractions. But then, through the small window beside her, she noticed something that made her freeze. The man she had berated was walking toward the private jet, flanked by ground staff who greeted him with visible respect. A sleek black car had pulled up beside the plane moments earlier, and now the man was casually ascending the aircraft's steps. Her champagne glass wavered in her hand as her mind raced to comprehend what she was seeing. "Wait," she whispered to herself, leaning closer to the window. "That can't be him, can it?" As if on cue, one of the flight attendants walking by overheard her muttering and glanced out the window. "Oh, that's Mr. Carter," the attendant said with a smile. "He owns the airline." The woman's face turned ghostly pale, her grip tightening on the glass. "He owns the airline?" The attendant nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He's one of the youngest CEOs in the aviation industry. Quite impressive, isn't it?" The woman slumped back into her seat, her pearls feeling heavier than ever. She stared out the window, watching as the private jet's engines roared to life. As Flight 157 taxied down the runway, the woman's thoughts swirled like a storm. She stared out the window, her polished demeanor unraveling with each passing moment. How could she have been so blind? The man she had dismissed so cruelly now sat in unimaginable luxury, aboard a jet he owned. Her shame only deepened as the flight attendant passed by again, offering another glass of champagne. "No, thank you," she mumbled, suddenly finding her voice less confident. In the meantime, on the private jet, Mr. Carter leaned back in a plush leather seat, a calm smile playing on his lips. His assistant, a young woman with sharp features and a professional air, approached him with a tablet. "Everything's prepared for the Miami conference, sir," she said. "We've confirmed your keynote address on innovation in aviation is set for tomorrow morning." "Thanks, Mel," he replied, scrolling through the tablet briefly. His gaze shifted out the window, catching a glimpse of Flight 157 lifting off in the distance. For a moment, his thoughts returned to the woman at Gate 12. He sighed, shaking his head slightly. "It's always the loudest ones," he muttered to himself. Back on the commercial flight, the woman could barely sit still. Her curiosity and guilt gnawed at her. How had she not recognized someone so important? What would people think if they knew how she had treated him? Unable to contain herself, she leaned toward the flight attendant who had mentioned Mr. Carter earlier. "Excuse me," she said, her voice unusually meek. "How long has Mr. Carter owned the airline?" The attendant smiled politely. "Oh, for about 5 years now. He took over from his father, who founded the company. Mr. Carter has expanded the fleet and brought in new technology to make flying more efficient and eco-friendly. He's something of a visionary in the industry." The woman's jaw tightened as she digested the information. "He sounds impressive," she said, struggling to keep her tone even. The flight attendant nodded enthusiastically. "He really is, and he's known for being incredibly humble. You wouldn't believe how many times he's shown up at our terminals just to check on the customer experience." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The man she had mocked for looking out of place had likely been there to observe how his customers were treated, and she had failed that test spectacularly. The rest of the flight was a blur. She barely touched her meal, her appetite gone. Every interaction with the staff felt heavier, her newfound knowledge casting a shadow over the casual politeness she had once taken for granted. As the plane descended toward Miami, her mind raced. Should she apologize? Would it even matter now? Or would he simply brush her off as she had done to him? The landing was smooth, but her nerves were anything but. As the plane taxied to the gate, the passengers began gathering their belongings. She moved quickly, hoping to avoid any lingering glances or whispered judgments from those who had witnessed her earlier behavior. But as she stepped into the terminal, her heart sank. Parked just outside the window was the sleek black and silver private jet she had seen earlier. And standing at the base of the stairs was Mr. Carter, speaking to a small group of executives who appeared to be eagerly taking notes. For a moment she froze. The urge to flee gripped her, but something else, a sense of accountability, kept her rooted to the spot. As the woman lingered in the terminal, clutching her designer handbag tightly, her pulse quickened. Mr. Carter stood mere feet away, exuding an effortless confidence as he spoke to his team. The sharp suits of the executives around him only accentuated his understated presence. He didn't need to overcompensate with flashy clothes or loud gestures. The weight of her earlier actions pressed down on her. Every instinct told her to keep walking, to slip away unnoticed. But something stronger, a mix of guilt and a rare spark of humility, urged her to stay. She inhaled deeply, adjusted her scarf, and took a step forward. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter concluded his discussion with a nod and a firm handshake. His team dispersed, leaving him momentarily alone near the jet. He glanced around, taking in the bustling terminal. Then their eyes met. For a split second, the woman thought about looking away, pretending she hadn't noticed him. But his gaze remained steady. Not hostile, not even surprised, just calmly observant. Summoning her courage, she approached him. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, each step amplifying her nerves. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He turned fully toward her, his expression polite but neutral. "Yes?" She hesitated, her meticulously curated words now tangled in her throat. I wanted to apologize for earlier." At the gate, his brow arched slightly, though his demeanor remained composed. "Oh?" She nodded, clutching her handbag tighter. "I was out of line. I made assumptions about you that were completely unfair. And I'm sorry." For a moment he said nothing, simply studying her with an unreadable expression. The silence felt like an eternity, and she braced herself for a cutting remark or dismissive response. But when he finally spoke, his tone was measured and calm. "I appreciate the apology," he said. "But let me ask you something. Why did you feel the need to say those things in the first place?" Her cheeks flushed. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just judged you based on appearances. And I was wrong." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "You know, in my line of work, I've learned that people's first impressions often say more about them than the person they're judging. It's not the first time someone's looked at me and assumed they knew my story." His words, delivered without anger or malice, cut deeper than any reprimand. She lowered her eyes, feeling the sting of her own arrogance. "I'll be honest," he continued. "When people act like that, it's easy to walk away, let them keep their assumptions. But I'm glad you came over." Her eyes lifted to meet his, surprised by his generosity. "You are?" He offered a small, understanding smile. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Not everyone does." She felt a flicker of relief, though the weight of her actions still lingered. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for not holding it against me." He gave a slight shrug. "Life's too short to dwell on things like this. Besides," he added with a playful glint in his eye, "I've got a plane to catch." With that, he turned and walked toward his jet, leaving her standing in the terminal. She watched as he ascended the steps, a mix of admiration and regret swirling within her. As the jet's door closed and the engines roared to life, she made a silent vow to herself, to be better, to do better, and to never again let prejudice cloud her judgment. The roar of the jet's engines echoed through the terminal as Mr. Carter's private plane began to taxi toward the runway. The woman stood motionless, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her earlier sense of superiority had dissolved into a strange cocktail of shame and self-reflection. As the plane ascended into the clear Miami sky, her thoughts mirrored its climb, rising above the pettiness that had clouded her perspective just hours before. She turned away from the window and found a seat near the gate, needing a moment to process everything. Nearby, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit was on the phone, his voice loud enough to carry over the terminal's low hum. "Yeah, I've got the pitch ready," he said, flipping through a well-worn notebook. "But I'm telling you, the key to landing Carter Aviation as a client is authenticity. That's what Mr. Carter values. He can see right through the fluff." The woman couldn't help but listen. Authenticity. The word stuck in her mind like a thorn. Had she been authentic earlier? Or had she been acting on a shallow instinct, a need to assert her perceived superiority? Her introspection was interrupted by the announcement of her flight's boarding. She joined the line, quietly observing the people around her. Every face told a story, some worn with stress, others bright with anticipation. For the first time, she found herself wondering about those stories, rather than judging the covers of the books. As she settled into her seat, she caught sight of the flight attendant who had spoken about Mr. Carter earlier. The woman's warm demeanor and genuine smile struck her differently now. When the attendant reached her row, the woman hesitated before speaking. "Excuse me," she said softly. The attendant paused, tilting her head curiously. Yes, ma'am? I was rude earlier, the woman admitted, her voice tinged with regret. You were just doing your job and I was not at my best. I'm sorry. The attendant blinked, clearly surprised, but her smile returned quickly. That's kind of you to say. Thank you. The interaction, brief as it was, felt like a small step forward. The woman leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply. As the plane climbed through the clouds, her mind wandered to Mr. Carter again. How many times had he faced moments like the one at the gate? How often had he been judged, dismissed, or underestimated? And yet, he had carried himself with such poise and grace, refusing to stoop to her level. She imagined him now, high above the same clouds she was flying through, steering his life with a confidence and vision that she could only admire. Later, as the flight approached its destination, the woman made another silent promise to herself. She would learn from this. She wouldn't just apologize and move on, but truly change how she saw the world, and how she treated the people in it. It wasn't about Mr. Carter's wealth or success. It was about the quiet dignity he had shown. A lesson that spoke louder than any lecture could. When the plane landed and she exited the terminal, the Miami air felt different somehow. Lighter. Fresher. She took a deep breath and stepped into the future, ready to face it with a new perspective. Weeks passed since the woman's humbling experience at the airport. Life had returned to its usual rhythm, but something inside her had shifted. The sharp edges of her judgment had softened, and she began to notice things she once ignored. The exhausted barista forcing a smile, the janitor working tirelessly in the background, and the security guard standing for hours with little acknowledgement. One crisp morning, she walked into a cafe for her usual latte. As she waited in line, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a client invitation to a gala hosted by Carter Aviation. Her heart skipped a beat. The name alone conjured memories of that pivotal day at the airport. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. Should she go? Could she face him again after everything? The barista's cheerful voice broke her reverie. Next in line, she snapped out of her thoughts, quickly placing her order. As she handed over her payment, she glanced at the barista's name tag. "Thank you, Mia," she said, offering a genuine smile. Mia looked surprised but smiled back. "You're welcome." The woman left the cafe feeling lighter. Small gestures, she realized, could make a big difference. The evening of the gala arrived faster than expected. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her dress and smoothing her hair. There was a nervous energy in the air, a mix of anticipation and self-doubt. Arriving at the venue, she was greeted by a sea of elegant guests mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. The room buzzed with conversations about business deals, philanthropy, and innovation. She spotted Mr. Carter almost immediately. Dressed in a tailored suit, he moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging warm handshakes and sincere smiles. His aura was magnetic, commanding attention without demanding it. The woman considered slipping away, avoiding an encounter altogether. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option. This was her chance to express something she hadn't fully conveyed at the airport. Taking a deep breath, she made her way through the crowd until she stood a few feet from him. He was mid-conversation with a group of executives when he noticed her. "Excuse me," he said to the group before turning his attention to her. "Good evening." She smiled nervously. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." His expression softened, and a hint of recognition sparked in his eyes. "The airport," he said simply, his tone neither accusing nor dismissive. "Yes," she admitted, feeling a mix of embarrassment and relief. "I'm grateful to have this opportunity to thank you, again, for how you handled that situation." He studied her for a moment, then gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. "Shall we talk?" Once away from the crowd, she opened up, recounting how their encounter had prompted her to reflect deeply on her behavior. "I've spent weeks thinking about that day," she confessed. "About how quick I was to judge you, how wrong I was. It's made me reevaluate how I treat people." Mr. Carter listened attentively, his gaze steady and his posture relaxed. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "It takes character to admit when you're wrong," he said. "But what matters most is what you do after that realization." She nodded. "I'm trying. I really am. And I wanted to thank you for showing me grace when I didn't deserve it." He smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "We all make mistakes. What defines us is how we grow from them." Their conversation flowed effortlessly after that. touching on life, business, and the importance of empathy. By the end of the evening, she felt a sense of closure, not just with him, but with the part of herself she was leaving behind. As she left the gala, she glanced back at the room filled with people inspired by Mr. Carter's vision. She realized that his success wasn't just measured in wealth or accolades, but in the way he uplifted others, one interaction at a time. Months later, the woman found herself at another airport, waiting for a connecting flight. This time, the experience felt different. The terminals bustled with the usual mix of travelers, business people, families, and wanderers. But she viewed them through a lens shaped by her encounter with Mr. Carter. She had grown since that day. Small, deliberate changes had rippled through her life, affecting not just her behavior, but also her relationships and work. She had joined a local community outreach group, dedicating her weekends to mentoring underprivileged youth. At work, she advocated for inclusion and diversity training, helping her colleagues see the importance of empathy in every interaction. As she sipped her coffee in the waiting area, she overheard a man nearby arguing with an airline employee. He was visibly frustrated, raising his voice as he demanded better service. The employee, a young woman, remained professional but was clearly flustered. The woman observed the scene, feeling a familiar tug in her chest. A few months ago, she might have dismissed the employee's struggles or judged the man for his outburst. But now, she saw an opportunity. She approached the counter gently. "Excuse me," she said, her tone calm and disarming. The man turned, surprised. "Travel can be so stressful, can it?" she said, offering a small smile. "I've had my fair share of delays too. Maybe we can figure this out together?" The man hesitated, the edge in his demeanor softening. He nodded reluctantly and stepped aside, allowing her to speak to the employee. Within minutes, they worked out a solution that satisfied both parties. As the man walked away, he offered a quiet thank you. The employee looked at her with gratitude, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what seemed like hours. The woman returned to her seat, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. Change wasn't always about grand gestures or monumental shifts. Sometimes it was as simple as choosing kindness in moments where it wasn't required. As she boarded her plane, she paused in the aisle, glancing at the first-class cabin. There, seated by the window, was Mr. Carter. Her heart skipped a beat, but this time it wasn't out of fear or regret. It was something closer to respect, and perhaps even pride. She debated whether to say hello, unsure if he'd remember her. But before she could decide, he looked up, and their eyes met. A smile spread across his face. "Fancy meeting you here," he said. She chuckled, stepping closer. "I promise I'm not causing trouble this time." He laughed softly. "I didn't think you were." Their brief exchange felt natural, like two old acquaintances catching up. She didn't stay long, respecting his space, but the interaction left her with a sense of closure. As she settled into her seat, she gazed out the window, watching the ground crew prepare the plane for takeoff. The journey she had begun months ago wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was heading in the right direction. As the plane ascended, she thought about Mr. Carter and the lesson he had taught her, without uttering a single harsh word. The world wasn't divided into those who succeeded and those who didn't. It was built by people willing to see the humanity in others, regardless of status, race, or appearance. And perhaps, in her small way, she was starting to see it too.